Hi everyone, I'm Sean Stitt and I'm joined here with Alice Gorman. She is a associate professor at the Flinders University in Adelaide in space archaeology. And Alice, would you like to tell us a bit more about yourself?
Well, first of all, I'd like to say thank you very much to the AYAA for this invitation. And I'm speaking to you today from the land of the Wiradjuri people, and I offer my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. So basically, I'm a space archaeologist. I work on the material culture of space exploration on Earth, in Earth orbit and on other planets. And I'm also an advisory council member of the Space Industry Association of Australia, and currently a UN mentor in the Space for Women network.
Fantastic. So Alice joins us today as part of the Aerospace Futures online conference. I'm a member of the committee for the 2020 conference. AYAA is the Australian Youth Aerospace Association, and they kind of represent university students and young professionals who are interested in the aviation and aerospace industries. Aerospace Futures is a yearly conference which brings students together from all over the country and gives them the opportunity to listen to students and young professionals in their industry of interest, to hear about potential career opportunities, research opportunities, and from amazing people like Alice. This year, due to COVID-19, Aerospace Futures has moved to an online format, and we've been presenting fortnightly interviews with people of interest. These include Jason Held from Sabre Astronautics and Peter Beck from Rocket Lab. So we're lucky to be joined by them and by Alice today. Alice, do you want to tell us a bit about your study and the work that you do and how you got into the field?
Well, I basically trained as a regular kind of archaeologist, I guess. So this involved doing a Bachelor of Arts at Melbourne University, after which I became a heritage consultant. And then I did a PhD at the University of New England. And this was on the use of stone tools in different parts of the world. I won't go into details on that, but you can look it up if anybody wants to know more about stone tools. So how I got into space, I guess, is a whole story to itself. So I basically was very keen to become an astrophysicist or an astronomer when I was a kid, but I was also intensely interested in human behavior and in human behavior in the past. And obviously I, devoted most of my early career to working in standard archaeology, but I had a revelation one day that there was all of this stuff in Earth orbit, all of this space junk. And effectively, I mean, what archaeologists really do is study the junk that people left behind. We study garbage, rubbish, trash. We're interested in the stuff people discard and what that can tell us about human behavior. So I was just looking at the sky thinking Earth orbit is full of space junk. So technically I could be able to do an archaeology of space junk. So that was kind of how these two things came together. So I started my interest pretty much in Earth orbit, but it's quite difficult to do archaeological fieldwork in space. So when I say quite difficult, I mean basically impossible. It's something like a millions of dollars price tag to actually go as a tourist to the International Space Station. So I had to think of other ways to study this material. One of those ways was actually to start looking at space places on Earth. So in Australia, of course, we have an incredible space heritage. So Woomera was one of my early areas of interest, and then I moved on to tracking stations. And these things are all basically the ground infrastructure for what is up there in Earth orbit and throughout the solar system. So they're really, many facets of the one kind of enterprise. And I study space junk by using the tracking catalogues, historical information, information about the environment that those objects find themselves in. And I've since moved on to the moon, so to speak. So I do look at lunar heritage in the context of the growing push to actually mine the moon. And Venus has been a planet of long-term interest. So I'm not on the Venus bandwagon because we recently had news, the exciting news that there was
Very exciting news.
life. I've long been interested in Venus because it's essentially, it is a Russian planet, as the head of Roscosmos said in the news recently. Russia has sent the most missions to the Venus surface, and there's a whole history and material culture around the human record on that planet. And I'm also quite interested in Mercury, which currently has one archaeological site on it, the place where the Messenger spacecraft crashed in 2015. But in 2028, it's going to get a second one when Bepi Colombo goes into orbit around it. So I suppose you could say I'm really studying the whole solar system in the context of how humans have used technology to engage with these very different environments.
Yeah. Something that you just mentioned then was Roscosmos and their claiming of Venus. What do you think is the role is of space agencies, universities, private companies, kind of anyone in space archaeology?
I suppose there's a few roles. Well, one thing is that these companies and agencies and universities are often the ones who are generating that material record. So they're making the stuff and creating those places where human material is throughout the solar system. So this is their heritage as well. So when I'm looking at something like the Russian landing sites on Venus, this is a sort of a particular national heritage that belongs to that very distinct evolution of Russian space technology. So they're creating it. Also, under the terms of the Outer Space Treaty, the launching state of any space object it retains ownership of that object, and it also retains legal liability for any damage caused by that object. So in fact, these nations and these organizations are still kind of responsible for their own heritage. And in my view, they ought to be taking a position where they consider it that it is cultural heritage that they should be interested in managing properly, or, in some instances, preserving for the future. And finally, I guess the answer to that is, as we see so many new missions being planned to the moon, to Mars, to Venus, to Mercury, it would be a really great idea if all of these different entities started working on cultural heritage management plans, which would firstly prevent them from needlessly causing damage to existing heritage sites, and which might include a component of how what they leave behind is to be managed as well. So I would like to see some of these organisations starting to create positions, actual paid jobs where they get somebody with expertise in space archaeology and heritage to work all of this stuff out for them. So I think there's basically many points of intersection here.
Yeah, sure. Something you just mentioned then was experts in space archaeology. How many are there? Is it just you kind of representing all of humanity at the moment, or?
I'm happy to say it isn't just me, but there's also not very many of us. So I've had some colleagues who over the years have worked for a bit on a space area and then sort of moved back into more regular terrestrial archaeology. And there's really not a very big, I would say, well, realistically, it's probably, I could count on the fingers of one hand the people who are working kind of full time in this area. And at this stage, I guess we're mostly university based as well. But I'm very happy to say that in recent years, people have started to realize more and more that this isn't, I don't know, this isn't just a little irrelevant sideline, that cultural heritage is actually a really critical part of how we engage with space. And I guess we saw that with the 50th anniversary last year of the Apollo 11 landing, which really raised and highlighted the issues that, these are unique places that could be destroyed just like that, like in one careless action. could literally destroy the footprints where humans set foot on another world for the first time. So while there's still not very many of us with specific expertise in this, there is at least a much greater awareness among the space sector and the general public that heritage is important.
Awesome. Just a reminder to all our viewers as well that you can submit questions to Alice via the comments. We'll try to ask as many of those as we can. Something you just mentioned then was the potential for these artifacts to be destroyed. What do you think might be the link between what you do in space archaeology and protecting those artifacts and the tourism that might come from them as well?
Yeah, very interesting point. So we've seen a lot of people talking recently about how we're going to have a much greater capacity to have tourists in space. And that ranges from suborbital to orbital to maybe going to the moon. And of course, it's a dream that many people have, to see the Earth rise or to see the sunrise through the light of another world. But we know what happens on Earth. So people want to go and see historic places. They want to go and commune with heritage, which is fantastic because that's what it's about. It's about connecting people. But the moon, for example, has some very particular characteristics. So the famous footprints of the astronauts have been preserved primarily because, you know, there's very little sort of weather as we think of it on Earth. And so apart from being bombarded by cosmic rays and the occasional micrometeorite, they're still there, something we don't get on Earth. But this fragility means all you need is somebody to approach with a rover and stir up a lot of dust, or land nearby, or just walk onto the site, and they're just gone. And if someone gets that close, then they're going to do something that, you know, tourists the globe over have done. They're going to want to take home a little souvenir. So get a few people doing that, and before you know it, those places have been broken up and sold. And there's a very vigorous market in selling space-flown objects. So people would pay big prices for a genuine piece of an Apollo landing craft. So we do need something. This isn't going to happen, you know, within the next 5 years, probably. But we do need something that will, you know, deter tourists from getting a can of spray paint out. And we've seen, you know, with examples like trying to get people to stop climbing Uluru, this is not easy. So we want people, it's a management issue. We want people to be able to see and engage with these places, but we don't want it to be the case that, you know, 20 years after the next people land on the moon, they're gone, they're erased. Those places are no longer in good condition.
Absolutely. I guess related to that question, we know that the ISS is due to be retired in the next maybe decade or so. Should that be made a heritage site and be, you know, like available for tourism?
That's a really interesting one. So the ISS has kind of been under threat for a while. It's incredibly expensive to run. It's an amazing symbol of sort of peace and international cooperation in space. But it's also, you know, there's a Russian segment, there's a US segment, a few other nations with segments there as well. And that, you know, there are tensions. It's not always big, happy families up there, but it's incredibly expensive to run. Its current lifetime is said to be around 2024, and the plan is to probably deorbit it, much as happened with the Mir space station, because you can't, at that altitude, you can't just keep it in orbit, and boosting it to a safer orbit where it won't have an uncontrolled re-entry anyways is so tricky. The whole thing, keeping the whole thing safe is tricky. But NASA have recently committed to ramping up the commercialization of ISS uses, and I think that's, you know, that's in a bid to get enough external funding to make it viable to keep going. So we've got a couple of options here. We don't really know what's going to happen to it, we have the entire International Space Station, which you could consider is one of the most significant spacecraft ever launched. It's the longest continuously occupied human habitat in space. And it has all of those symbolic resonances. I mean, one I think is quite beautiful is how the ISS has come to be represented as Father Christmas and his sleigh, so that little kids go out at Christmas time. There are trackers set up online so they can go out and look at the ISS and say, well, there goes Santa Claus or Father Christmas. So it has come to have a resonance for people on Earth that's sort of more than just, you know, its scientific achievements or the international cooperation thing. So there's no doubt that it's tremendously significant, but we have to balance that against the risks of leaving, for example, an unoccupied space station in orbit. And the safest thing to do with it is, you know, a controlled deorbit, but then it doesn't exist anymore. Well, as it happens, I do have a small solution to this. One of my current research projects is doing an archaeology of the International Space Station, but from the inside. So with Justin Walsh from Chapman University in California, we've been given access to NASA's image archive, which is, we think, about 7 million images. And we're using machine learning techniques to analyze them to actually find out what crew on the International Space Station do to kind of create their own space culture, their own space society. And this will give us an insight into how the ISS has kind of shaped the lives of its inhabitants. So we will have a good record and we'll have analysed those features of the ISS as an archaeological site. The big difference being normally when we look at an archaeological site, there's not people actually living in it. So that is a little bit of a difference, but it, of course, it means we can talk to people. So we will have an interesting analysis of what life inside the space station is like. But I guess we're all preparing for, at some point, its life to come to an end. And there's probably no way around that. Like it's just too dangerous to have floating around. It's the largest human object in orbit at the current time. And, you know, heritage isn't all about keeping everything forever. Sometimes it's about letting things go as well, while also recognizing their tremendous cultural significance. So that's okay. It's okay that happens.
Yeah, I guess, I mean, no one's forgetting about ISS anytime soon, even if they do deorbit. So it still had a lasting impact on science and culture and everything, I think.
I believe you're right.
I guess related to that is the issue of space junk, which is probably one of your most well-spoken about topics. A question from my audience: where are the current rules and regulations regarding space junk lacking in protecting our orbits from, you know, dangerous or excessive, you know, impacts, things that might be detrimental to the success of missions or people?
Yes, that's a really good question. I would say there's some big sort of unresolved areas, and part of the reason they're unresolved is because they're, you know, quite difficult and contentious. So something that we don't currently really have any clear guidelines about is how an active debris removal program could guarantee itself to not be anti-satellite weaponry. And obviously we have a difficulty in Earth orbit because it's not that easy to monitor what's going on there. I mean, we have plenty of objects which are looking at stuff, but they're usually looking at Earth. They're not looking at what else is going on in Earth orbit. So something that needs to be resolved somehow is a mechanism so that all of the methods for active debris removal that we're seeing tested now. So Surrey Satellite Systems had a successful test of a harpoon mechanism to remove a piece of debris just in recent last couple of years. So that's very promising. But there needs to be some kind of regulation about how to go about that. For example, you know, will a space agency or a nation only ever be allowed to remove stuff they themselves have launched into space? What about objects that are, big international collaborations? So how do you get everybody to the table to agree that there will be a particular method of removing it from orbit? Where do we draw the lines between when it starts edging into space warfare, which is a situation everybody is very, very keen to avoid? So there could probably be a lot more work done around this at the moment. An area I think is interesting, so people would be familiar with space situational awareness, which is the sort of current dominant paradigm of how we approach space junk. I find this interesting because while space situational awareness it's all about knowing where things are in order that you can make good decisions about how to act in space in the future. But it derives from a defense context. It's very instrumental. It is about having a sustainable use of space, and it's about trying to make sure that we can continue that. So that's all good. I don't have a problem with that. But this is a very different approach to looking at space as an environment. And something I've argued for quite some time is that we haven't really developed a good concept of space as an environment. Something that's working against that is that we're so used on Earth to thinking of environments as things that have living components. So if you take that away, then the idea is that, oh, well, there isn't an environment that needs to be managed. The only thing we have to do is ensure our ability to use those assets. In my opinion, I think we need to go back to the drawing board and work out what exactly that environment is. We need to know more about how that interacts with human-made materials and their actions. And we need to consider what values that environment has beyond our use of it so that we can make even better decisions about how we're going to continue in space. So I think that the complete lack of an integrated environmental philosophy is something that there could really be some more work on. And I should add here, Sean, yes. So a lot of people say, you're mad. What are you doing? We don't want to keep space junk. It's dangerous. And my argument is absolutely not that we keep all space junk. My argument is that there's very well-developed systems for figuring out what has cultural significance and what doesn't, and balancing those against risks that we use on Earth all the time. And it would not be difficult to apply that to space. So I don't want to keep everything. There's no need to keep everything. What I'm arguing for is that we have a robust evidence-based process for what we keep and what we don't keep. Yeah. I just want to clear that up because people say that to me all the time.
Well, related to that, another question from our audience is, do you have any ideas about how you can, get everyone to the table in terms of space agencies, private organizations, your launch companies, your satellite users, everyone, get them all to the table at the same time to discuss debris management?
Well, in some ways, we're already doing pretty well at that. So there's the Interagency Debris Committee, which has representatives from all agencies across the world that considers these issues. We also have the United Nations Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, and the technical and legal subcommittee of that, which are all considering these things at the international level. I suppose you could say part of the problem here is that their processes are sort of slow moving, and maybe we need to move a little bit faster than that. I'll also draw in here a statistic I heard a couple of years ago at a space debris conference, which is that at least 40% of all missions sending stuff into Earth orbit do not follow the existing guidelines, which have been around for quite some time, on how to minimize the amount of debris they create through their missions. So that's 40% of those space agencies, private corporations, all of that stuff, just casually saying, those rules apply to everyone else, they don't apply to me. So that's not great, is it? That's not a really great indication of people being, responsible citizens in space. So maybe we need some new organisations to kind of step up and do a little bit more coordination. And of course, we're also looking at, there's such big defence interests in space. And I mean, in a lot of countries, there's very close relationships between civil and defence space, but it also means, like, you know, you and I aren't going to know a lot about what's going on in the defence domain. So that does also make it incredibly difficult to have a coordinated front. But something I think is critical, I'm sure many people, you know, in the audience now will have had the experience that, you know, you'll be chatting to a friend or a family member, or you'll be at a party or something and talking to people about space junk. And people are absolutely surprised, like they're shocked to learn how much there is, and shocked to learn what the dangers and the risks are. And people often say to me, like, I didn't know this, like, how can I not have known this? Like, this is important. And I'm a big believer in sort of mobilising public opinion to get involved in these debates. And for that to happen, well, a couple of things, like we have to have the information out there. The information has to be accessible. And the other point about this is kind of, I consider this to be an aspect of looking at space heritage. So when we say heritage, what we're really talking about is things from the past that are important to people. That's a key component of it. And I think this allows us to get people relating to space in a different way, you know, so they're not thinking space is out there, it's got nothing to do with us. They're thinking, well, this is a satellite that was launched from Woomera, you know, it's in my backyard, or I'm in Perth and here's the new Norcia tracking station that's currently, you know, there are spacecraft up there. There's you can use it to actually make people feel connected to space in their own lives, in their, you know, beyond the mobile phones and all those space services. And I think that's a really important way of getting the public engaged in space and getting them informed and getting them, you know, involved in having opinions, and maybe telling politicians what those opinions are, and putting pressure on space players to be more responsible citizens in space.
Absolutely. Definitely sounds like it's a big issue. Well, I mean, we know it's a big issue, but it's very nuanced, complicated, all that sort of thing. There's no one simple answer, obviously.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right about that.
Now, something that you mentioned earlier, and that I know that you've been involved with a bit more recently in your career, is space mining. And so do you just want to kind of start by explaining to us what is space mining, and how will we do it, and why might we do it as well?
Yeah, there's been a lot of talk about getting resources from space, and it looks like, you know, we might actually start to see that happening within the next 5 to 10 years. So there's a few features to it. Well, perhaps I'll start this by saying, when I was a heritage consultant on Earth, I mostly worked in mining industry. So that meant, you know, I would be out in the field with exploration geologists drilling to define the ore targets. I would be out clearing areas before they were blasted to extend a big open cut coal mine. Sometimes I was involved in doing, you know, a heritage survey before they rehabilitated an abandoned mine. So this has left me with a big interest in how mining actually operates. So, and I also find mining quite interesting. So I'm not going to say that I love the destructive impacts of mining on the Earth or other planets or anything, but I do find the technology fascinating. And I think it comes back to an environmental management problem. So at the moment, we've got a few propositions. So there's the idea that we could use the moon or asteroids to get resources that we're, you know, maybe starting to run out of a bit on Earth. So people are talking about rare earth elements, they're talking about iron and other things like that. So the idea would be these would be used in a terrestrial economy. Then we have using resources in situ in order to sustain habitation, let's say on the moon or on Mars, or to use lunar resources to get to somewhere like Mars. So stuff used on Earth, stuff used in space. And people are looking at asteroids and the moon primarily. At the moment, the big target on the moon is frozen water ice at the poles, particularly in the permanently shadowed regions of the lunar South Pole, which can be used for fuel, oxygen, a whole range of things. So the idea is that these will be used locally on the moon, because we're not at the present time in short supply of water here. So my interest in this is really pretty similar to what I used to do with terrestrial mining. I'm interested in the impact it's going to have on the heritage places, and there are over 60 places on the moon, for example, where there are human landing sites, including the 6 Apollo sites where people have actually been. So I'm very interested in that. I'm also interested in the impacts on the environment. So something with the moon, I mean, you'll hear a lot of talk about how Australia is very well positioned to get into lunar mining because we have all of this expertise in automation. And that's true, we really do. But what people don't often mention when they talk about this is that no amount of remotely controlled mining equipment is going to help you if it's all clogged up with the incredibly fine and abrasive lunar dust. And this is going to have big impacts on the environment. So some models have calculated that if sufficient lunar dust is stirred up, it may actually enter orbit and form a dust cloud around the moon. So that's not going to be great. This dust is really abrasive and sticky. That's not going to be great for vehicles coming and going from the moon or lunar orbiters. And it's also going to alter the visual appearance of the moon from Earth, which is a whole other question about our relationship to the moon and what might happen if we disturb its environment. So there's a lot of questions around this stuff that I think haven't been sufficiently addressed yet. And I think it would be great to see more Australian space scientists and aerospace engineers getting involved in some of these questions. So yeah, something to consider, I guess.
Absolutely. One last very quick question from the audience. How do you feel about the way that Earth and I guess humanity as a whole is proceeding with reaching the point where we can do long-term missions to the moon and to Mars and to other planets?
I don't know actually how I feel about that. I'm going to say right here and now, I don't want to go to Mars to die. I'm quite happy to stay here on Earth. I do think that, there's this long-standing argument that we can do everything we need to do in space by robots. It's cheaper, it's more effective, it potentially will cause less damage. But I think there are some things that you can only understand if you experience them, with your own senses inside a human body. And I also think we know so little of the solar system. This is, one of the proposals before we thought there might be life on Venus. One of the reasons people, including me, were pushing for another mission to Venus was because we just don't understand enough of the history of the solar system, how the Earth got to be the way it is. I mean, Venus used to be pretty similar to Earth in climate. Now it's clearly not. So there's all this stuff we need to know. And I think, and there's stuff we need to understand. So I do want, okay, so this is how I feel, I guess. Like I do feel that humans need to continue gathering information about the solar system because, from one week to the next, some fact could just completely, overthrow what we thought we knew. And we can't make good decisions about Earth unless we understand our place in the solar system. I guess I'm also happy, like if people want to go to Mars to die, that's their decision and I support their right to do that. But they are going to die. That's what's going to happen. Elon Musk, for example, has spent a lot of time talking about humans becoming a multi-planetary species. Gotta say, like that's taken on a life of its own. Like people now talk about being a multi-planetary species as if that's a self-evident concept. I'm kind of inclined to think it's a mask that hides from us the possibility that we will see going to space create massive divisions between rich and poor on Earth. They're not great right now. And many science fiction writers have spoken of futures where the rich escape the Earth before environmental collapse, leaving the poor behind. So when at the moment, we're talking about affluent elites who will have the capacity to undertake this, deeper solar system movement. And if we don't want to end up in the situation where we have this massive divide, I think we do have to rethink some of this. I think we have to, it's all well and good to talk about being a multi-planetary species, but we don't even have the technology at the present time to sustain an enclosed biological system. Human bodies are not adapted for different gravities. And it's, maybe that is something that will come in the future. It's not a reason not to go either, but I think we've got a lot of optimism out there that is just not based on evidence. And I think we, need to be a little bit more critical about some of the rationales we tell ourselves for getting out there and going to these places. And I'll just say right now, I don't think late industrial capitalism is a great model for our relationship and use of space. We tend to have this idea that just being there will somehow make us closer to a sort of a utopian kind of society. But at the moment, good heavens, it's not what we're seeing happen on Earth. So we have even less reason to be optimistic about that than we used to have. So yeah, I guess I have complex feelings, Sean, about all of this. And I also think that's okay. Like you don't have to be on one side or the other side. I think it's actually quite fine to have mixed feelings and to have bits that you think are acceptable and other bits that you want to critique.
Absolutely. I think an agnostic view is entirely reasonable on something like this. Unfortunately, that's about all we've got time for. So thank you so much for your time. Apologies to our audience that our interview couldn't go longer, but we understand that you've got a very busy schedule, being one of only a handful of space archaeologists.
Well, apologies for that. I would have loved to have stayed longer as well, but thank you so much for inviting me to be part of your ongoing conference.
No worries at all. So thank you everyone for watching. There's a few short AYAA announcements that I'd like to make. Firstly, we're looking for committee members for Aerospace Futures 2021, which will be held in Adelaide next year. Applications close at midnight on the 1st of October. So if you're interested in contributing to the organisation and running of the conference in any way, then I absolutely encourage you to apply. Secondly, we've got 2 interviews being released soon over the next month. So we're talking to Pam Melroy live from the US on October 7th at 9 a.m. Eastern Time, who is an ex-astronaut and is currently working at Nova Systems. And finally, we've got a Shoal panel on systems engineering as a career. This is a pre-recorded interview and will be released in the coming weeks, but you will be hearing from a junior, middle level and senior systems engineer about how they use systems engineering in their career. So once again, thank you everyone for your time. Thank you, Alice, for your time greatly. And we'll see you all again soon.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.